the change in that totally rigid work structure to a totally unstructured retirement is a big change.
If you could go back to your first retirement, the day before, maybe a few months before, and give yourself a message, what do you think you'd say?
I was really focused on what's the difference between people that have good, successful transitions to retirement, enjoy retirement, versus those that don't. What is challenging to you and what you're trying to work out is how do you make this retirement thing successful? And it's not around money. I was trying to differentiate what leads some people to have a successful transition and others to struggle. And there is one clear thing.
Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Fritz Gilbert. He's the founder of the Retirement Manifesto. He's also the author of The Keys to a Successful Retirement. So after his corporate career, he retired, and then he spent 7 years documenting his retirement journey and helping others navigate this major life transition. So in this conversation, he shares some really big golden nuggets, I thought. It's things like setting up the 3-bucket strategy, how he did that and how he manages it, and then how he manages investments throughout the year over the last 7 years or so. Also some surprises that caught him off guard in retirement, and then also some of the challenges. And then, really importantly, what are the happiest retirees? What are they doing? What do they have in common? So this is packed with a lot of wisdom, whether you're close to retirement or already retired. One note here, my camera switched in the middle of the interview, so I apologize for the odd angle if you see that, but let's dive in. Okay, so first off, Fritz, welcome. You've, just a little background, you've been retired for I think over a decade from your corporate career.
7 years, actually, 2018. Yep.
Okay, 2018. And now, officially, as of a few weeks ago, you're retiring from your retirement career or your blogging career. Of doing that. You've done that for a decade, right?
I've done that for a decade. Yeah, I'm calling it Retirement 2.0. And it's not necessarily a retirement. I wanted to notify my readers that, hey, I'm not going to be publishing as regularly as I have been. And I didn't want to just kind of go dark and fade away and not do a post for a couple months and have them wonder what happened to me. So I made it a retirement announcement, but it's more a scaling back and just, finding more times to do other things that I love to do and getting out of my office and spending more time outside. So that's really what it's all about.
I love that. Can we rewind back to your first retirement of leaving corporate? So we help a lot of people with exactly that. They're doing their first retirement. What were the biggest surprises, would you say, if you can remember from that first year?
I mean, obviously I wrote through the whole thing. I've actually written a retirement reality series. So I said, like, on the first week, what was the first week like? What was the first 6 months? What was the first year? So it's been kind of fun to document it. And as I went through that, I kind of talked about some of the surprises. Probably the biggest one, it's kind of like getting married or having a child. You can't really understand what it's going to be like until you go through it yourself, right? So I was really curious what it was going to be. And it's hard to explain what it's really like. How do you explain what it's like to be married, right? Until you do it, it's hard to understand. But I would say the biggest surprise was probably the impact that structure has. I always talk about the 5 things you lose from your job besides your paycheck. You lose your sense of identity, you lose your sense of purpose, you lose your relationships, you lose your structure, right? And you lose that sense of accomplishment when you achieve something, in your work and you get a pat on the head. So, but the structure thing kind of surprised me because everybody says, oh, it's like, every day is a Saturday. You can just do what you want to do. And that's actually disorienting. And I think planning some structure into your retirement is helpful. So I played around with that. That was one of the things I kind of tweaked. And I took some classes at the gym. So every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I was doing spin, and I intentionally structured some things into my week that added some of that structure, and that helped smooth things out. But the change in that totally rigid work structure to a totally unstructured retirement is a big change. And that's probably the thing that caught me the most by surprise.
Wow. Can you give us a few more examples of things that you've added when you're trying to add that structure, and what stuck, what didn't stick?
Yeah. One was, I was doing this beforehand, so I didn't add it. I started my blog. We mentioned my blog, The Retirement Manifesto. I started it 3 years before I retired as kind of a trial. Let me see if I enjoy this writing. It'll be, maybe something I explore in retirement. And it turns out I loved it. So that was something that definitely added structure because I was posting every Thursday. For 6 years, I posted every Thursday. So for the first 3 years I was writing, I had not yet retired. And then the first 3 years of retirement, I continued to post every single week. So what I would do to accomplish that deadline was I would carve out maybe an hour every morning where I would focus on writing. So my mornings were kind of my structured time. I went to the gym, as I mentioned. I would carve out time to work in my office and write. So my mornings were pretty structured. And then in the afternoons, I would be more, my favorite word, serendipitous. And I would just kind of do what I felt like doing. And that worked pretty well. So I would say the two biggest things were structuring my writing time. And you could do the same thing if you just have emails and stuff like that. Carve out a time where you say, okay, I'm gonna make an hour of office time and I'm gonna spend it on my computer, do whatever you do. And make it structured rather than just random. And that will help accomplish kind of developing some of the structure.
I like that. I like the mornings for structure, and then whatever happens in the afternoon happens.
Yeah, that works well. And I would say I still kind of keep to that. I've got less structure now overall. I've dropped the gym classes. COVID hit. I built a home gym. So now I just kind of work out whenever I want to work out. So that's less structured. But I've found when I first retired, I was more comfortable with a little bit more structure. And as my retirement evolved, it became less structured. So now my days are much less structured. I don't do the gym at a set time. I obviously backed away from the writing because I wanted to spend more time outside. I've gotten very active. My wife runs a charity called Freedom for Fido, and we build free fences for low-income families with dogs on chains. And we've built 172 fences, helped over 400 dogs. So that takes a tremendous amount of time, but it's unstructured, right? We don't know exactly when the builds are going to be. It's depending on the client's schedule. I manage all the inventory, so I've got to run to Tractor Supply and Home Depot and buy stuff. That's all unstructured. So I'm busy, but it's in a much less structured format, which at this point I'm more comfortable with.
Yeah. Some of the things you're saying remind me of something that we'll talk about quite a bit, which is making sure that we've got, after the career, have things that are creative, such as writing, things that have contributions, such as Freedom for Fido. The one thing that we didn't talk about yet is connection. And I know men especially can have a harder time after the work life is done to reconnect or connect with new guys. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, and that's a great one. And let me give some color to that too. I wrote an article about why I started with why 28% of retirees are depressed, and I went through not having purpose and the retirement shock and things like that. And then somebody said, well, why don't you write about the 72% that are happy? What's unique about them? So I did some research, and I came on some of Wes Moss's stuff, which he's written a lot on this. And one of them was on the relationship side. And the average happy retiree has, I wrote it down, it's, 3.6 close friends, whereas the average unhappy retiree only has 2.6 close friends.
Oh, wow.
So the more close friends you have, it is more indicative of a happy retirement. So what I've done, I did two things. One, before I retired, I was very intentional about what do I need to start doing now to position myself for this transition, and recognizing the need for relationships and the reality that your work relationships are going to fade. As much as you might want to keep them going, they just don't. I intentionally started building relationships outside of the workplace that would be there after I retired. To give you an example, there was a small festival in our town, and there was an author's booth. I hadn't yet published my book, but I was writing my blog. So I went up to the author's table, and there was a guy that had written about some personal finance stuff. So I was like, hey, let's get together and have lunch. So every quarter, or slightly more frequently, we'd have lunch, for years. And he's unfortunately had some health issues and whatnot. But I was intentionally seeking out relationships, outside the workplace that would be there after I retired. That's number one. The second thing, and this was just really a blessing from the charity work, and this can be true if you can find any organization to get engaged with that has people that have similar interests to you. When we started the charity, we've gotten now a core of maybe 50 active volunteers. We've become really close friends with a lot of them. We do things. We go out to dinner with them. We go to movies. We have impromptu meetups, at the microbrew or whatever. And that source of friendships, we've got a common interest. We're building dogs, things like that, building dog fences. And that's naturally led to some really good close relationships. And then the last thing I'll mention is I started a retirement mastermind, and I did this probably year 3 of retirement. A friend of mine suggested, hey, you're writing this blog, I'm getting ready to retire. I'd love to have a couple of guys that I can talk to about this stuff. So we put together a mastermind group, and we got together every month, and we did it for 2 or 3 years. And then, we'd kind of talked about most of what we were going to talk about, but I had 9 guys that would meet, once a month. And it turned into some really close friendships that I'm still very close with today. And I'll go hiking with the guys. We'll get together, go out on one of the guys' boats. We still do stuff a lot. It's really look for opportunities to connect with people, make them, in the case of Mastermind, get involved in organizations, which was the charity work, and look for opportunities like at the festival where I connected with this other writer. Just be aware of the need and be intentional about trying to develop it is the best, the best way that I've found through that difficult issue. You're right. Men struggle with it more than women do.
I like that with the writer. It's almost like your tribe of people, right? Like other writers you'd probably connect to quicker, and it's more fun. Or entrepreneurs would connect with entrepreneurs, right? So that maybe just as a practice, I'm guessing you already knew this or did it, but just your what's the type of people you like to be around? Go to where they're at.
Oh, and the other thing I would say is, try different. The other thing I found is finding a way to give back to others is tremendously fulfilling. So not only, and you mentioned this earlier, but not only do you get that sense of fulfillment by giving back to others, but you develop relationships with the other people that are volunteering with the same organization. So what I would encourage people to do, hey, before you retire, take a Saturday and go check out Homeward or Humane Society, or go walk a dog at the animal control, or do a Habitat for Humanity build. Get involved in a couple different charities. Just go for a day. Kind of pay attention to the people. And are you connecting with people? Are they friendly? Are they kind of your type of people? If not, okay, step away from that one and try another one. You do that 2 or 3 times, you're going to find a group of people that you connect with. It's the way it works. Like people tend to aggregate together. And we found that, and everybody says about our charity, it's so great because you guys are just always having fun. Credit to my wife for that. She said, we're going to keep this fun. We're not going to talk politics. It's all about the dogs. I'm going to joke around a lot. I'm going to always have fun at the builds. So she was very intentional on making it a fun environment. And our volunteers have recognized that. And the word around our town is, man, Freedom for Fido is like the best charity. They're great. They have a lot of fun together. They joke around. And you'll find the group of people if you just explore a little bit, pursue your curiosity, and get engaged, try some things. It's on you because, you don't have a boss telling you what to do anymore. It's your responsibility to find things that give you fulfillment and develop those relationships.
Yeah. And get out of the comfort zone a little bit.
Yeah.
That's great. You actually sent you a message, I think on LinkedIn something.
Yeah, it was LinkedIn, I think. Yeah.
Here's the question. You've written quite a few times about how before retirement, 90% is financial, focusing on financial.
Yeah.
And then after you retire, it switches to where 90% of the focus is on lifestyle and purpose and meaning and all these other things. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that shift, did it catch you off guard? Do other people get caught off guard? How do we navigate that?
Yeah. Great question. And I had heard about this as I was, I obviously have done a lot of research on retirement. I've been writing on it for 10 years, right? And I was really focused on what's the difference between people that have good, successful transitions to retirement, enjoy retirement versus those that don't. And so I've written a lot on that topic. And as I was doing that research, I came across this concept that, you think about money all the time when you're ready, planning for retirement. But once you retire, after a year or two, you've kind of set up your system to make up your paycheck, whatever. You've been through maybe some volatility in the market. You made it through, you figured out your cash cushion, all those types of things. And you start realizing, man, you don't worry about it as much. You know what you have to spend. You settle into that spending pattern. It's, if you've done your homework right, it's sufficient to meet your needs. And over time, you just think about it less and less and less. And I was like, no, that's never going to happen to me. I was a money nerd. I had all the spreadsheets, Since I've retired, I update our net worth once a year. And that's about it. I look at, I have the bucket strategy. So I look at opportunities to refill the cash bucket, throughout the year a couple times, kind of a rebalancing exercise, but that's it. And it's happened to me, and I never thought it would. So I wrote this article. It's called the 90-10 rule of retirement. And everybody I've talked to, and nobody believes it, but almost everybody, once they get into retirement, now it might not be the same for people that got forced into retirement early. They weren't financially ready. They're barely scraping by. Okay, fair enough. But for those that have done their planning and were able to retire on their schedule and, did their homework up front, money becomes a non-issue. And you find that what is challenging to you and what you're trying to work out is how do you make this retirement thing successful? And it's not around money. It's around all those other non-financial areas that's where you find your true joy and happiness. More money doesn't, up to a point, everybody's seen those studies, more money up to a point, but once you get over 100,000 a year, or whatever the number is, it doesn't add happiness. And it's kind of the same in retirement. Once you've gotten enough to cover your basic needs and a few wants, you learn to live with it, and you don't care about the financial stuff as much. You've always got the worries, you got the inflation stuff,
Yeah.
but you worry about it so much less. It's really shocking how big that transition is. And it's not a light switch. It's a gradual phase.
Yeah.
But the longer you go, the less you worry about it.
I love that. We'll draw the picture sometimes of just a simple, here's your retirement date, and stress level will sometimes increase closer you got all these things you're trying to manage, and then it goes back to normal later, and you get back to a regular pace of living. But that's great to hear. That's really great to hear. You mentioned a few things. We're talking about 90-10 and starting with 90% financial. You mentioned the bucket strategy, and can you give kind of just a high level view? We also will help clients with that. And
Sure.
The best thing we've seen is just through any of these shocks or hard times or extended periods, it's just been the best for peace of mind. Over the last 16 years of doing this, 2008, all the stuff in between COVID, it's been great. But tell us a high level view, if you're okay, how you kind of set it up.
Oh yeah. I've written a whole series of articles called The Bucket Strategy. I think the first one is How to Create a Retirement Paycheck. And I've done like 6 articles in the series. I went through my first bear market and I said, how's the bucket strategy working in the bear market? Things like that. How do I replenish my spending accounts? So I've written a lot of articles about it, but very high level. It's basically, it's more of a mental thing than anything. It's really just determining your asset allocation in simple forms. So the way I look at it, let's just say you've got 30 years worth of spending saved, to make the math easy. If you've got 30 years worth of spending saved, that says your safe withdrawal rate's going to be about 3.3%. Okay, just to put it in context for people that think in safe withdrawal rates. So if you're using the 3.3% safe withdrawal rate, you got 30 years worth of stuff saved. If you take 3 years of that and put it in cash, sounds like a lot, but 3 years out of 30, it says 10% is going to be in cash. Okay, that's bucket one. And I chose 3 years. Somebody else may choose 2 or 4. You can modify these buckets based on your risk tolerance. So I chose 3 years under the assumption that that's going to ride out most of, the risk, obviously, is sequence of return risk. You don't want to sell stocks after a down market or in a down market. So you have enough cash to absorb the majority of that volatility. If that's not sufficient, then bucket 2, you've got another 5 to 6 years. Let's call 6 years to make the math easy. 6 out of 30 is 20%. And you tend to put that in bonds. And that is there so that if stocks continue to be down, historically, bonds tend to be a pretty good diversification play, and stocks are down, bonds tend to be more stable. So you can start pulling from your bonds. So the one change I made a couple of years into my retirement, if you remember 2020, both stocks and bonds went down at the same time. So rather than just have mutual funds or ETFs that held bonds, I modified that with time, and I set up more of a ladder approach where I've got bonds that are maturing at every 6-month intervals. So I don't have to worry about the interest rate risk. I can hold the bonds until maturity, probably too much detail, but it's a little bit safer way to have access to those funds if you need them. And if the market is good, the stock market is good, and a bond matures, I'll just roll it back into another rung of the bond ladder. If the stock market's down, I'll just use that cash as the bond matures to refill bucket 1 cash. And then the last bucket is, so if we do 10% cash, 20% bonds, the rest would be 70%. And that tends to be stuff that you need to keep up with longer term inflation risk and longevity risk, which is higher growth, higher volatility stocks. And I throw some alternatives in there. I've got some REITs, I've got some commodities, precious metals, stuff like that. But it's primarily stocks. So that's in a nutshell how it's set up. But it's just asset allocation, and then having a strategy for when you're going to replenish your cash, and keeping that cash as full as you can, but also being willing to pull it down if the markets aren't participating, and knowing that you've got bucket 2 if you need it. So it's really it helps so much in these volatile times. I don't worry at all. I hit the downturn in 2020, COVID, of course, it bounced right back up. I think this is my 3rd correction or bear market since I've retired, and I don't worry about them at all, Dave. It's just, this having a structure like this pre-planned and in place, it takes away all that anxiety.
That's so good. Yeah. I love that. I could nerd out on this and ask a lot more questions, but I think that's a perfect answer. Perfect amount of information.
Okay, right.
So, one of the things that stood out to me in your writing is how a lot of retirees will end up with a lot more than when they started, right? If you've
Yeah.
done at 65, you might be nervous. Maybe you'll do the trips or vacations or things, but still 20 or 30 years later, it just keeps growing.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's hard? If you've done any research, why is it hard for savers to become spenders?
I've written exactly on this topic. Why is this hard to spend? And I've written some examples about how I'm trying to, I've been a lifelong saver, and I'm teaching myself to spend. I told the story of a mountain bike, and I liked a mountain bike, and I was wanting to get a new bike, and I was looking at the e-bikes. I was like, man, but they're like $5,000, and I could buy this decent bike for $1,500. And I was like, you know what? You're getting older. I'm living in the mountains. Hills are tough. I was like, God, go ahead and splurge, spend the $5,000. But you've, again, kind of like building those relationships or adding structure to your day. Learning to spend is something you've got to be intentional about. And a lot of retirees struggle about this. It's one of those surprises because you've been a lifelong saver. Now you're free to spend. So let's talk about why assets grow. If you're using a 4% safe withdrawal rate and the markets historically return 10%, right? Now it's not 10% every year. Obviously you'll get, like the last 2 years, 25%, right? We had some really big years. I'm pulling less than 4%. Of course your net worth is going to grow, right? So the safe withdrawal rate strategy, if you look at the Bergen study and Trinity study and all the research on it, it's looking at the worst market environment over the course of retirement. What's required to make it through? So in anything better than the worst market environment over that 30 years, you're going to have more money if you're using a safe withdrawal rate of 4% or less. So, I saw something. I wish I would have written it down. I just read an article yesterday. Somebody had done the math on if you use a 4% safe withdrawal rate, and just as an example, the numbers aren't right, but it makes sense to me. The average retiree has something like twice as much money as they retired with after 20 years, right? It was some kind of formula like that had been proven over the time. And the vast majority of retirees, let's say your listeners, right? The ones that are really struggling, maybe not. But if you're responsible and you've saved and you're paying attention to the stuff, you've got a good advisor, whatever, you have a much, much greater chance of retiring with a lot more money than you did at retirement than you do the other way around. People's biggest fear is running out of money. It's a greater fear than death. You probably saw that article that came out this week. But the reality of it is you're probably going to have the other problem. You're going to have so much money. And if you talk to some 80-year-olds, right, all of them are giving a lot more away to charity. They're like, I can't spend all this. And it's gotten so big. And, and now they're using a 2% safe withdrawal rate because they got so much money and they can't spend it. And they're in their slow-go years and they can't take the big adventures anymore. And their lifestyle's pretty simple. Their expenses are pretty low. You get into healthcare the last couple of years, fair enough, but it's still not going to consume the vast majority of retirees' portfolios. So read Die with Zero, think about what are those adventures you want to do while you're still young enough to do them, and teach yourself to spend. So one trick that I do, we set up the bucket strategy. I mentioned this. So every month I've got money coming into our checking account from our bucket strategy. At the end of the year, if our checking account has grown, we have to give it away. That's a rule my wife and I set up, right? So it forces you to spend. So we're like, hey, we might as well do the expansion on the house because if we don't, we're going to be giving the money away anyway, right? Because we don't necessarily do it every year, but over a couple of years, you'll see that checking account balance growing because you're not spending to that safe withdrawal rate that you can comfortably spend to. So force yourself to give it away, force yourself to spend.
Yeah. Wow. I like that. I should be writing down the questions that come to mind as you're talking because there's a lot of things. So you agree with the go years, slow go years, no go years?
Yeah. I think that's just reality, right? We're all getting older every day, and your body, you can do there's certain things you can control, right? And if you look at this, why 72% of retirees are happy. One of the traits that happy retirees have in common is they have a focus on physical fitness. I'm avidly focused. One of the reasons I'm writing less is because I want to spend more time. I'm going to go out for a trail run this afternoon after what I'm talking. 2 days ago, I went swimming in the lake. Yesterday, I did spin. I probably try to do some pretty decent cardio 3, 4, or 5 days a week. And then I've started doing weights because as you get older, it's the atrophy of muscle that leads to, you're less mobile. So, do squats, lift weights. And I've never done that. I've always been a runner. I've always focused on cardio stuff. But when I retired, I've added a very intentional and diligent weight routine in because that muscle atrophy is what leads to that slow go, no go. And you can read Younger Next Year, great book.
Yeah.
It's a doctor that's focused on longevity, and it's one of his clients. They co-wrote it together, and the doctor's talking about the medical reasons that exercise helps. And his basic thing is spend 45 minutes a day doing something, even if it's just a brisk walk, that's sufficient. If you do that, you can do stuff in your 70s that you did in your 30s and 40s. And he's got this client that would then jump in and talk about he's skiing black diamonds at Vail and he's 72 years old, right? You can delay that. Now, maybe you have cancer, maybe there's a legitimate health issue that comes up, fair enough. But short of that, you can certainly help control your aging process and extend those go-go years. It's not a fait accompli that you're going to fade. You can keep that lineup pretty well into your late 70s, even early 80s, and do quite a few things before it drops off.
Yeah.
So
it reminds me of Peter Attia and its lifespan, health span.
Outlive. Yeah. Great book.
Yeah. When thinking about, so now, just a few weeks ago, you had sent the message out about doing less with the blog. And I'm just thinking, how did you make here's what we see a lot of people do is kind of the one more year when they're in their corporate career or their business. I'll go one more year, but add a little bit more just for security. And then the next year comes, oh, there's tariffs. I can't retire now. Things are too uncertain. I'll go for one more year. How did you make or what recommendation do you have to people?
Yeah,
who are in that?
I suffered from that myself. I was debating between retiring at 54 or 55. So I was young early. Okay, one more year, who cares? You're only 55, right? But still, I was facing that thing and I was debating, should I retire at 54 or should I retire at 55? And I talked to an uncle of mine who was 10, 15 years older. And he said, look, Fritz, he said, you're at your peak earning years right now. If you decide to go back to work after the fact, you'll never make the money you're making now. So if you're not quite sure, put in one more year because you'll never regret having a little bit of a cushion. Fair enough. So I was kind of in that situation. I was looking at, high 3s, low 4s for a safe withdrawal rate. You've got to look at your projections. You got to know your spending. You got to do the math, right? But ultimately, if those things say you can make it, then your resistance to leaving is probably not triggered by the financial, even though that's the excuse you're giving it. It's more that resistance to change because retirement's scary, retirement's hard, it's anxiety inducing, etc. One of the biggest changes in life. So what I recommend to people is do the math, but once the math says you're good and you're still kind of dragging your feet, I want a little bit more buffer or tariffs, volatility, whatever. Okay, fair enough. Let's give it one more year, but set your date right now. April 1st, 2026, I'm out no matter what happens because you're already good financially. Okay, there's some uncertainty. There's always uncertainty. But if you're at a 3.5% safe withdrawal rate and, okay, markets aren't doing real well, but still you're at 3.5% safe withdrawal rate, the safe withdrawal rate study took in market volatility by definition in the study when they came up with those numbers. It can handle volatility. So make sure you got your cash bucket in place. If you don't have that, that might be a reason to work one more year. You don't want to sell stocks now. The sequence of return risk doesn't start on the day you retire, right? It starts a couple of years before you retire. So you don't want to sell a bunch of your stocks in your last year of work to build up your cash. Maybe you say, okay, I'm going to quit contributing to my 401k. I'm going to take all my savings that I normally do, and I'm just going to push it into a money market account. Fair enough. That might be a reason to work one more year. But once you get to that point, don't just keep using that for an excuse. Set a date, make it happen. Your life is never better than in retirement. It's a great way to live life. And most people I've talked to have regrets that they waited rather than retired earlier because now they've got more money. We talked about that. And they're like, I could have retired a year or two earlier and had an extra year or two of freedom. And I didn't because I was scared. And now I wish I would have. You can't go back, right? So give it a year, put a date on your calendar, put a timer on your clock. You can get those little countdown time wraps on your phone, which I recommend everybody do. Set the date, make it happen, and don't look back.
That's great advice. Do you think it was a little bit easier for you having this blogging career? I don't know if it was earning some sort of income or maybe, supplemental income. Do you ever recommend that for people who are maybe retiring in the 50s or their 60s and they feel like they still have contribution to give? They still have things to give or ideas or want to do something.
Yeah. The way I looked at that, Dave, was I planned for no supplemental income. When I did all of our retirement planning, no supplemental income. Since then, obviously, so I wasn't making money with the blog at the time. For the first 4 or 5 years, I didn't try to monetize it. I was just writing because I love to write. And I think if you're trying to develop a blog or a YouTube channel or something, like this, purely with the goal of making money, you're not going to be successful. You've got to do it because you love doing it. So if you're going to do it for the first 3 years, build up your audience with no expectation of making money. Once you get to a certain size, and this is where I was 2 years into retirement, your expenses start going up because you got to pay more for your email service and things because you got more subscribers. Your back office fees start going up. And I was like, I'm in retirement. I probably shouldn't be spending money on a hobby if I can make a little bit of money. So I started monetizing it. And it was, it was paying enough. It was paying my healthcare. I got out at 55. So it's been paying my healthcare since then. That's fine. But that wasn't my objective. So my plan was for no supplemental income. And I would encourage other people to do the same thing because if you plan for supplemental income and suddenly you're not making that money, oops, you should have worked a year longer making the big bucks before you gave up the highest pay in your career, assuming you'd have some supplemental income in retirement. Now, realistically, if you do something you love, chances are you might make some money at it. That's all just gravy. That's just money you can spend or give away.
So it sounds like your next stage, it sounds like you're retiring to maybe this health. You've been focused on health for a while, but it sounds like that's a key component. Is there anything else that you're thinking about or you see yourself starting in the next?
Yeah. Starting is interesting. If I looked at, I wrote an article about, it was one of my retirement reality series articles, or no, it was retirement is nothing like I thought it would be. And I talked about how if I look at the things I'm doing now, back up. If you had asked me in my last 6 months of work, what do you see yourself doing in retirement? Here's a notebook, write down 100 things. The things that I'm doing now wouldn't have been on that list. It's really weird, but it's just been pursuing your curiosity is the biggest thing you can do, right? Curiosity is huge. So pursue those things that interest you, and you'll be shocked where they lead. I'm in my writing studio. You can see behind me. On the other side of that door right there is my woodworking shop. I'd never planned on doing this in retirement, but we had to spend the money. It was coming in. So we built this woodworking shop because I started falling in love with woodworking. It wasn't something I did before I retired, but we got into this charity work. We needed to build dog houses. A buddy of mine, relationships, had a workshop. I went over there and helped him build some dog houses, learned how to do it. Said, this is kind of fun. I'd like to have a woodworking shop myself. And by the way, we kind of need it for the charity. So it led to that. So, the things that I'm doing aren't really things I expected to be doing. The thing that is the byline of the article, retirement is nothing like I thought it would be. The byline was retirement is exactly like I thought it would be. Because the things that I wrote a post called The 10 Commandments of Retirement right before I retired. And it was all about mindset. Pursue your curiosity, find ways to help others, have gratitude, attitude of gratitude, things like that. So it was more mindset focused. And every one of those 10 commandments I've been living by, and it's a mindset focus. So the mindset is exactly what I had kind of targeted for myself. Where it's led has been totally unexpected. So I'm kind of expecting the future is going to be the same. I don't have, it's not, I'm going to stop blogging so I can start a YouTube channel. I haven't done that. It's just, I have so many cards in my hand right now. And I talk about how retirement's like a game of poker. I put this in my retirement post. You can pick up a card or put down a card anytime you want. So I'm just putting down this card for a little while because my hand's kind of full and I want to explore some of these other cards. Down the road, I might pick it back up, Yeah. But I haven't gotten, I hated 5-year plans. I was in a strategy role for a couple of years in my corporate job, and we had to do all these 5-year strategic plans. And I told myself, I'm not going to do that in my life. I'm just going to live serendipitously. I'm going to pursue my curiosity. We're going to see where it goes. I'm just going to have a positive attitude wherever things lead. And so I don't really have a big plan. I've got buddies that, they can tell you 3 years from now, they're going to take a cruise to Greece and they're going to do this and they've got it all mapped out. We don't live that way now in retirement because we don't have to. We just explore and enjoy every day and see where it leads.
Oh, that sounds great. I love that. Yeah. And different personalities, right? Like your buddies, they would go crazy if they didn't have that, right?
And that's the beauty of retirement, right? You can make it whatever you want to make it. You don't have a boss anymore. So you can make a 10-year plan if you want, and you can fill out a spreadsheet with everything you're going to do by month for the next 10 years. That's fine, right? That's adding more structure. If you want that structure, knock yourself out. The beauty of retirement is you have total freedom to live it however you find as you experiment, trial and experimentation, right? As you trial and experiment, and you find things that kind of work for you and you move in that direction. Maybe you want that structure. Fine, go with it. Whatever works for you. It's really, incredibly rewarding to be in a stage in life where you can choose how you want to live it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic. You've already given tons of great information, little golden nuggets in this. This is super valuable. If you could go back to your first retirement the day before, or maybe a few months before, and give yourself a message, what do you think you'd say?
I've looked back, and I've talked about this on other podcasts and with other people. I couldn't be happier with how our transition has gone. So I think the way I'd answer your question is, what have I learned through this? And it was focused in my book, Keys to a Successful Retirement. But what I've learned through the last 10 years, 3 years planning for, now 7 years living in retirement. The biggest single piece of advice that I would give others is, I mentioned earlier, I was trying to differentiate what leads some people to have a successful transition and others to struggle. And there is one clear thing that stood out above all others in terms of the correlation to that. And it's how much time you spend planning for retirement before you get there. And that's not just on the financial side. It's probably almost more important to plan on the non-financial side. And there's been a direct correlation between how much time you spend in that planning and how successful the transition is. So the one thing I would say to people is get away with your wife or your husband. Go someplace where you think you might want to retire. If you're going to retire where you're living, that's fine. Take a week or two off of work and don't do emails. Try to get away from it. Do it over a holiday and say, let's just think about what we want our retirement to be. Those types of things pay back huge dividends. Just taking the time to talk about it, taking the time to think about it. You're still going to do your job. You're still hired. You're still getting paid. What I found myself doing is, when I was at work, I was still at work. But when I was away from work, I intentionally shut off the work mode in my head, and I shifted that brain time into retirement thinking. And I do as much of that as you can. That's the biggest thing that I've found and the research has found that leads to a smooth transition and ultimately a successful retirement.
I love that. I'm going to put a link below to, it's just me asking about 12 to 15 questions to married couples that you usually don't talk about. And
excellent.
Yeah, I'm sure if you've got a post like that, I'll link that too. But
I don't think I do, actually. I might ask those 12 or 15 questions to my spouse. So I'll look at them. Yeah,
I already have.
I probably have.
Any parting words? It seems like an exciting time for you. It's, another mini transition, or I don't know how big it is in your mind, but it seems like an exciting time. Thanks for sharing all of this wisdom. It's so cool to have somebody who has done it and wants to share the path, or at least just the experience. And you can either take it or leave it. But
exactly. Yeah. Well, and thanks for the opportunity, Dave. I think, what's resonated with my readers, there aren't a lot of us old retired guys out here that are writing about this stuff. A lot of academics, a lot of planners, a lot of people that are helping people retire. But people that have actually gone through the transition and are being totally transparent about the experience, like I have been, it's a pretty small population. So I think that's what resonates with my readers. I think the thing I would tell people is, yeah, your last year, 6 months of work, you're nervous about it. Everybody's nervous about it. I was nervous about it. But recognize that, yeah, it's going to be a transition. Don't fool yourself. It's a big change. Give yourself time. Be patient. Follow your curiosity. Do a lot of trial and experimentation, give yourself time, and recognize that of all the people surveyed, those that have been retired 2 years or longer are the happiest population in the country. So retirement is a great time, and don't be scared of it. Just do your planning ahead of time and give yourself time to make the transition, and you'll have a great retirement. It's a wonderful, wonderful time in life.
Thanks, Fritz.
Dave, thank you. Nice talking with you. Appreciate you reaching out.